The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windsor Castle like a gray shroud, mirroring the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the royal household in recent weeks. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood at the tall window of her private sitting room, her fingers pressed against the cool glass as she watched the groundskeepers tend to the autumn gardens below. The vibrant colors of the changing leaves seemed muted today, as if nature itself sensed the weight of the decision that had been months in the making. Behind her, the familiar sound of William's footsteps echoed across the polished hardwood floor. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. After more than a decade of marriage, she could sense his presence like a sixth sense. The rhythm of his walk was different today, hesitant and measured, lacking the confident stride that usually accompanied the future King of England. "The car will be here in 20 minutes, William said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them like an unspoken accusation, though neither had done anything wrong. Sometimes the cruelest circumstances are those that arrive without fault or blame, simply as the inevitable consequence of duty and destiny. Catherine finally turned from the window, and William felt his breath catch in his throat. Even after all these years, even in moments of profound sadness, she still had the ability to render him speechless. Her auburn hair caught the pale morning light streaming through the windows, and her green eyes held depths of emotion that he knew he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She was wearing the simple blue dress he had always loved, the one she wore on quiet Sunday mornings when they pretended to be just an ordinary family. "I know," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. They had talked about this moment countless times over the past months, planned every detail, rehearsed every word they would say to the children and to the public. But now that it was here, all those carefully crafted speeches seemed inadequate and hollow. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had been building like storm clouds on the horizon, darkening their private conversations and stealing into their quiet moments together. The pressures of royal life, the constant scrutiny, the impossible balance between duty and family, it had all reached a crescendo that neither could ignore any longer. They had tried everything: counseling, compromise, even brief separations that the media had never learned about. But some chasms grow too wide to bridge, even with love as deep as theirs. William moved closer, stopping just a few feet away from her. Close enough to see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. Close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume that had been his anchor through countless public appearances and private struggles. Yet the distance between them felt infinite, a gulf created not by animosity, but by the crushing weight of circumstances beyond their control. "The children don't understand," Catherine said, her composure finally beginning to crack. "George keeps asking why I'm taking so many suitcases for what I told him was just a visit to grandmother's house. And Charlotte," her voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Their daughter's innocent questions about when Mummy would be coming home had been like knives to her heart. William's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted nothing more than to reach out and pull her into his arms, to hold her until this nightmare passed, and they could return to the life they had built together. But he knew that would only make what came next more difficult for both of them. Instead, he focused on memorizing every detail of this moment. The way the morning light played across her face, the familiar gesture of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the strength in her posture even as her world crumbled around her. "They'll understand when they're older," he said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. "How do you explain to children that sometimes love isn't enough? That sometimes two people can care deeply for each other and still be unable to find a path forward together?" The complexities of adult relationships were difficult enough for grown-ups to comprehend, let alone for young minds trying to make sense of why their family was changing. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the words they couldn't say and all the promises they couldn't keep. Outside, a flock of starlings rose from the oak trees in a synchronized dance, their movement fluid and graceful despite the chaos of their individual flights. Catherine watched them through the window, wondering if she would ever feel that kind of freedom again. "Do you remember," she said suddenly, "our first Christmas here? You were so nervous about the Queen's reaction to the pudding I made." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine expression of happiness William had seen from her in weeks. William's own smile was bittersweet. "You nearly set the kitchen on fire." The smoke alarms went off during Christmas dinner. The memory was precious to him, one of the last times they had felt truly carefree together, when their biggest worry was whether Catherine's homemade dessert would meet royal standards. Your grandmother was so gracious about it, Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger with the memory. She said it reminded her of her own early attempts at cooking during the war. They both knew that Her Majesty's blessing had meant everything to Catherine, who had spent years worrying that she would never truly fit into the ancient institution of the monarchy. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drifted up from the courtyard below. Both of them froze, knowing without looking that Catherine's transportation had arrived. The moment they had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure was finally upon them. There would be no more delays, no more postponements, no more pretending that somehow everything would work itself out if they just tried hard enough. William walked to the window and looked down at the sleek black car waiting in the circular drive. The driver stood respectfully beside the vehicle, hands clasped behind his back, patient and professional despite the emotional weight of the journey he was about to undertake. In a few hours, he would deliver Catherine to a place where she could begin the process of rebuilding her life away from the spotlight that had followed her for so many years. I should go, Catherine said, though she made no move toward the door. Her suitcases had been packed for days, sitting in the adjoining room like silent witnesses to the end of an era. Everything she would need for the foreseeable future was contained in those few bags, a pitiful summary of a life that had once encompassed palaces and state dinners, charity galas, and official portraits. Not yet, William said, turning back to face her. Just not yet. His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Catherine felt her own resolve beginning to crumble. They had promised themselves they would be strong, that they would handle this separation with dignity and grace. But, standing here in this room where they had shared so many quiet mornings and intimate conversations, it was impossible to maintain that composed facade. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the space between them like a spotlight on a stage. Soon this room would be empty, cleaned, and prepared for whatever came next. But, for now, it still held the echoes of their laughter, the warmth of their shared silences, and the bittersweet beauty of a love that had simply run out of ways to survive in the world they inhabited. Outside, the starlings had settled back into the oak trees, their brief flight of freedom over as they returned to the familiar safety of their roosts. Catherine watched them with eyes that were finally beginning to fill with tears, understanding all too well the choice between freedom and security, between what the heart wants and what the world demands. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed softly, marking another minute closer to goodbye. Neither of them looked at it, both preferring to exist in this suspended moment where endings hadn't quite arrived, and new beginnings remained terrifyingly uncertain. In 20 minutes, Catherine would walk out of this room and out of the life she had known for over a decade. But, right now, she was still here, still his, still part of the story they had written together before circumstance forced them to write separate chapters. The weight of unspoken words filled the space between them, heavy with regret and love and the cruel recognition that sometimes the most profound connections are the ones that hurt the most to sever. They stood there in the growing morning light, two people who had once promised to face everything together, now facing the hardest thing of all, letting each other go. The 15 minutes that followed felt like both an eternity and an instant. Catherine moved through her final preparations with mechanical precision, each action deliberate and careful, as if she were performing a sacred ritual rather than simply gathering the last of her belongings. William watched from the doorway, memorizing the graceful way she moved through the space that had been theirs, the unconscious gestures that had become so familiar over the years of their marriage. She picked up a small silver frame from the dresser, their wedding photo, taken in those golden moments after the ceremony when the weight of the world briefly lifted from their shoulders, and they were just two young people drunk on love and possibility. Her thumb traced over the glass, over their younger faces beaming with unshakable confidence in their future together. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that this image, broadcast to billions around the world as a fairy tale come true, now served as a painful reminder of how even the most beautiful beginnings can lead to the most heartbreaking endings. "Take it," William said quietly. "Please." Catherine looked up at him, surprise flickering across her features. "William, this is your home. These memories belong here." "No," he said, moving closer. "That day belongs to both of us. Everything beautiful about it came from you, from us together. I have 1,000 other photos, 1,000 other reminders. But you." He paused, struggling with words that felt inadequate for what he was trying to express. "You should have something that reminds you it was real. All of it. The happiness, the hope, it was all real. The photo frame felt impossibly heavy in her hands, weighted with years of shared dreams and private jokes, intimate moments stolen between public appearances, quiet Sunday mornings when they forgot about titles and protocols and simply existed as husband and wife. She wanted to refuse it, to leave it behind with everything else that belonged to this life she was walking away from. But the earnest hope in William's eyes made her nod and carefully place it in her handbag. A soft knock at the door interrupted the moment. "Your Royal Highness?" came the gentle voice of Margaret, Catherine's longtime personal assistant. Even through the closed door, they could hear the emotion the older woman was trying to suppress. Margaret had been with Catherine since the early days of their marriage, had helped her navigate the treacherous waters of royal protocol and public scrutiny. In many ways, she was losing more than just an employer. She was losing a daughter figure she had come to love deeply. "Come in, Margaret," Catherine called, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened to reveal the silver-haired woman who had become such an integral part of their household. Margaret's usually impeccable composure showed cracks around the edges. Her eyes were slightly red, and her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she held a leather portfolio. "I've prepared all the documents you requested," Margaret said, approaching with the careful dignity she had maintained throughout 3 decades of royal service. "The children's school schedules, medical information, your personal correspondence that will need forwarding. Everything is organized and clearly labeled." Catherine accepted the portfolio with genuine gratitude. Margaret had thought of details that she herself might have forgotten in the emotional chaos of the past few weeks. The woman's professionalism and care had been a constant anchor during the storm of decision-making and preparation that had led to this moment. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything. Not just today, but for all these years." Catherine's voice caught slightly. "You've been far more than an assistant. You've been a friend, a guide, a voice of wisdom when I needed it most." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. Tears began flowing freely down her cheeks as she reached out to embrace the woman she had served and supported through countless challenges. "Your Royal Highness, Catherine, you've been the light of this house. Whatever happens next, wherever you go, you carry our love with you." William watched the exchange with a complex mix of emotions churning in his chest. Margaret's tears were a reflection of what everyone in their inner circle was feeling, a profound sense of loss that extended far beyond his personal heartbreak. Catherine had woven herself so thoroughly into the fabric of their lives, had brought such warmth and humanity to the cold stone walls of royal tradition, that her absence would leave a void felt by everyone from the household staff to the groundskeepers who tended the garden she loved. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of another visitor. The door opened again, this time admitting Charles, the king, whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. Even in private family moments, there was an unmistakable gravity to his bearing, the weight of centuries of tradition and responsibility that he carried as naturally as breathing. "Catherine," he said simply, his voice gentler than public appearances ever revealed. The king had always maintained a complex relationship with his daughter-in-law, deep respect and genuine affection tempered by the sometimes conflicting demands of family love and institutional duty. Today, the man won out over the monarch. "Your Majesty," Catherine replied, offering a small curtsy that Charles waved away with an almost impatient gesture. "None of that today, my dear. Today you're simply family." He approached her with the careful deliberation of someone choosing his words with infinite care. "I want you to know that this family, this institution, will always consider you one of our own. Circumstances may change, living arrangements may evolve, but you will always be Charlotte's mother, George's mother, Louis's mother. That makes you irreplaceable to us." The kindness in his words nearly undid Catherine completely. She had spent years wondering if she would ever truly belong in this world of ancient protocols and unspoken rules. To hear the king himself affirm her permanent place in the family constellation, even as she was preparing to leave it physically, was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. "That means more to me than I can express." Charles turned to his son, and the look that passed between them contained volumes of unspoken communication. As a young man, Charles had faced his own impossible choices between duty and heart, had learned firsthand how the weight of the crown could complicate even the most fundamental human desires. He saw his younger self reflected in William's anguish, understood the particular torture of loving someone you cannot hold on to. "The children will understand, in time," Charles said to both of them. Love takes many forms, and sometimes the most loving thing we can do is allow each other the space to grow and heal. They're fortunate to have parents wise enough to choose their well-being over appearances. The mention of the children sent a fresh wave of pain through both William and Catherine. George, Charlotte, and Louis were the innocent victims in this adult drama, too young to understand why their world was shifting beneath their feet. They had been told that Mummy needed to spend some time away, that sometimes grown-ups needed space to think and feel better, but the confusion in their young eyes had been almost unbearable. Where are they now? Catherine asked, though she already knew the answer. With your parents, William replied. They wanted to say goodbye, but we thought it might be easier. You were right, Catherine interrupted quickly. This is hard enough without. She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of trying to explain this separation to her children while maintaining her composure was beyond her current emotional capacity. Margaret quietly excused herself, sensing that the family needed privacy for these final moments. As the door closed behind her, the room felt simultaneously more intimate and more vast, as if the absence of even one witness made the magnitude of what was happening more real. I should check on the driver, Charles said after a moment, recognizing the need to give his son and daughter-in-law these last precious minutes alone. Take all the time you need. His exit was graceful and respectful, leaving behind only the weight of his blessing and understanding. William and Catherine found themselves alone again, but the atmosphere had shifted. The arrival and departure of others had served as a reminder that their love story, while deeply personal, had always existed within a larger tapestry of relationships and responsibilities. They weren't just William and Catherine saying goodbye. They were the Prince and Princess of Wales, parents, family members, public figures whose personal choices rippled out in ways they could barely comprehend. 10 more minutes, William said, glancing at his watch, though he immediately regretted drawing attention to time's relentless march. 10 more minutes, Catherine agreed, and something in the way she said it suggested both resignation and relief. The anticipation of goodbye was sometimes harder than the goodbye itself. They stood there in the morning light, no longer reaching for words to fill the silence. Instead, they let themselves exist fully in the moment, storing up memories of this room, this light, this feeling of being suspended between what was and what would be. Soon enough, the world would intrude with its demands and expectations, its questions and speculation. But for these final minutes, they belonged only to themselves and to the love that had brought them this far, even if it could not carry them any further along the same path. The clock continued its steady rhythm, marking time with the same indifference it had shown to their wedding day, to the births of their children, to all the moments of joy and sorrow that had filled the years between. In 10 minutes, Catherine would walk out of this room and into an uncertain future. But right now, she was still here, still part of the story that would always be theirs, no matter how many new chapters life might write for each of them separately. The final minutes passed with an almost dreamlike quality, as if time itself had become fluid and unpredictable. Catherine found herself moving through the motions of departure while feeling disconnected from her own actions, watching herself gather the last items, check the contents of her handbag, smooth down her dress one final time. William remained near the window, his gaze alternating between watching her and staring out at the grounds that would soon be hers only in memory. A soft chime from her phone indicated a message, likely from her mother, confirming arrangements at the other end of her journey. Catherine glanced at it briefly, but didn't reply. Soon enough, she would be thrust back into the world of logistics and practical concerns, of rebuilding a life that had been intertwined with another for so long that she had almost forgotten where she ended and their shared existence began. I keep thinking about our first real fight, Catherine said suddenly, surprising them both. It wasn't what either of them had expected her to say in these precious final moments. Do you remember? It was about something so trivial, whether to serve fish or beef at that charity dinner. William's smile was genuine despite the sadness in his eyes. You threw your planning folder at me. I did not throw it. I set it down with considerable force. Her own smile was the first real one he had seen in weeks, and it made his chest ache with the memory of all the laughter they had shared. We were both so passionate about everything back then. Every decision felt monumental. Maybe that's where we went wrong, William said thoughtfully. We forgot how to fight about small things because everything became about duty and appearances and what was expected of us. The observation carried no blame, only the weariness of two people who had gradually lost themselves in the roles they were required to play. They had been so young when they married, so confident in their ability to maintain their authentic selves while fulfilling their royal responsibilities. Neither had anticipated how the constant scrutiny would slowly erode their privacy, how every gesture would be analyzed and interpreted by people who knew nothing about their real lives. The pressure to be perfect had eventually made it impossible to be simply human with each other. I used to wonder if we would have made it if we had been ordinary people, Catherine mused. Just William and Kate, with normal jobs and normal problems. We'll never know, William replied. But I like to think we would have found a way. He paused, considering his words carefully. The truth is, I can't imagine a version of myself that doesn't love you. In any world, under any circumstances, I think I would have found you and fallen completely. The honesty of his statement hung in the air between them, beautiful and terrible in its simplicity. Love hadn't been their problem. If anything, love had been the source of their greatest joy and their deepest pain. Loving someone completely while being unable to create a life that honored that love was perhaps the cruelest irony of all. A gentle knock interrupted their reflection. This time it was Thomas, the head butler, whose presence indicated that delay was no longer possible. His weathered face showed the strain of maintaining professional composure while witnessing the dissolution of a family he had served with devotion. "Your Royal Highness," he said to Catherine with formal courtesy that couldn't mask his personal affection. "The car is ready when you are." Catherine nodded, suddenly, feeling the weight of finality settling over her like a heavy cloak. This was it, the moment she had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. There would be no more postponements, no more stolen minutes, no more pretending that somehow everything would work itself out if they just wished hard enough. She picked up her handbag and took one last look around the room that had been her sanctuary for so many years. The morning light had shifted, casting different shadows across the familiar furniture, as if the very space was acknowledging the change that was about to occur. Tomorrow, someone would come to pack away the remaining traces of her presence, transforming this from their private retreat into just another beautiful but empty room in the castle. "I'll walk you down," William said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions clearly raging beneath the surface. "No," Catherine replied gently. "I think it would be easier if we said goodbye here. This is where we belong together, in the quiet moments, away from everyone else." She was right, and they both knew it. The grand staircase and formal entrance hall were public spaces, designed for ceremony and spectacle. This room was theirs, filled with memories of lazy Sunday mornings and whispered conversations in the dark, of shared silences and comfortable companionship. William nodded, understanding immediately. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, close enough to notice the small scar above his left eyebrow that he had gotten falling from his bicycle as a child. Details that belonged to her alone, intimate knowledge accumulated over years of loving attention. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Find whatever peace you need. Find whatever makes you happy." "You too," she replied, reaching up to touch his cheek one final time. Her hand lingered there for a moment, memorizing the familiar geography of his face, the slightly rough texture of his early morning stubble, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips. "Be the king you were meant to be, the one I always knew you could be." They stood like that for several heartbeats, close enough to kiss, close enough to change their minds, close enough to pretend for just a moment longer that love could conquer the circumstances that had driven them apart. But they both knew that some chasms were too wide to bridge, some wounds too deep to heal simply through wanting. "I love you," William said, the words carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say, everything they couldn't change, everything they would always share despite the physical distance that was about to separate them. "I love you too," Catherine replied, and her voice didn't break because these weren't words of goodbye. They were words of eternal truth, as unchanging as the sunrise, as permanent as the ancient stones of the castle around them. She stepped back then, breaking the spell of proximity, and turned toward the door before her resolve could weaken. William watched her go, committing to memory the confident set of her shoulders, the graceful way she moved even in the midst of heartbreak, the subtle strength that had first attracted him to her all those years ago at university. At the doorway, Catherine paused and looked back one final time. William stood silhouetted against the window, morning light creating a golden halo around his figure, and for a moment she saw not the Prince of Wales but the young man who had nervously asked her to dance at a charity ball, who had laughed at her terrible jokes, and brought her tea in bed on rainy mornings. "Goodbye, William," she said softly. "Goodbye, Catherine," he replied, and the formal use of her full name felt both strange and appropriate, a return to the boundaries that protocol demanded even as their hearts rebelled against such distance. She walked through the door without looking back again, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she moved toward the grand staircase that would take her down to the waiting car. Behind her, William remained at the window, watching as she emerged from the castle's entrance and crossed the courtyard below. The driver opened the car door with practiced discretion, his movements efficient and respectful. Catherine slid into the back seat, her blue dress a bright spot of color against the vehicle's dark interior. She didn't look up at the window where William stood watching, but he could see her shoulders shaking slightly, the only outward sign of the emotional storm he knew she was weathering. The car door closed with a solid thunk that seemed to echo across the grounds. The engine started with a quiet purr, and after a moment's hesitation, the vehicle began to move slowly along the curved driveway toward the main gates. William pressed his palm against the cool glass of the window, an unconscious gesture of reaching toward something already beyond his grasp. He watched until the car disappeared through the castle gates, until even the sound of its engine faded into the morning air. Only then did he step back from the window, the sudden absence of her presence in the world feeling like a physical blow. The room seemed larger now, emptier, filled with echoes of conversations that would never continue, and touched by shadows of a future that would unfold very differently than either of them had once imagined. Outside, the groundskeepers continued their work, oblivious to the personal drama that had just concluded. Life at the castle would go on, adjusted and adapted to accommodate this new reality. But, for William, standing alone in the room where he had just said goodbye to the love of his life, the world felt fundamentally altered, as if the very axis on which everything turned had shifted when Catherine walked out the door. The morning light continued to stream through the windows, indifferent to human heartbreak, marking the beginning of the first day of their separate lives. In the distance, church bells began to toll the hour, their ancient bronze voices calling across the countryside with the same rhythm they had maintained for centuries, witnessing countless arrivals and departures, hellos and goodbyes, beginnings and endings in the endless cycle of human experience. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's departure, and William found himself caught in the strange liminal space between his old life and whatever came next. The castle continued to operate with its usual efficiency. Staff members performed their duties, meetings were held, official correspondence was managed with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized royal operations for generations. Yet underneath this veneer of normalcy, everyone felt the absence of the woman who had brought such warmth and humanity to these ancient walls. William stood in his private study, reviewing documents that required his attention, but his focus kept drifting to the empty chair across from his desk, where Catherine used to sit when they worked together on charitable initiatives. She had been more than a partner in marriage. She had been his closest collaborator, the person whose insights and instincts he trusted above all others when it came to connecting with the people they served. Her absence wasn't just personal, it was professional, leaving a void in his ability to fulfill his duties with the same effectiveness he had grown accustomed to. The children had adjusted to their new routine with the resilience that young people possess, though William could see the confusion lingering in their eyes. They video-called their mother every evening, their faces lighting up when her image appeared on the screen, chattering about their day at school and the games they had played in the garden. But, after each call ended, there was always a moment of quiet sadness, a recognition that something fundamental had changed in their world. "Daddy, when is Mummy coming home?" Charlotte had asked the night before, her small hand slipping into his as they walked through the garden she and Catherine had loved to explore together. "Mummy is taking some time to rest and think," William had replied, using the explanation they had agreed upon. "Sometimes grown-ups need space to figure out what will make them happiest." But she seemed happy here, Charlotte had observed with the piercing logic of childhood. She smiled a lot, and she laughed at your silly jokes. The innocent observation had cut deeper than William expected. Children saw things that adults sometimes missed or chose to ignore in favor of more complex explanations. Catherine had smiled, she had laughed, she had seemed to find joy in their life together. But he was beginning to understand that contentment and true fulfillment weren't always the same thing, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was admit that what looked perfect from the outside wasn't sustainable on the inside. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his brooding. Margaret entered with her usual discreet efficiency, carrying a silver tray with afternoon tea and a small stack of personal mail that had been sorted from the official correspondence. "Your Royal Highness," she said, setting down the tray with practiced grace. Her manner had remained impeccably professional since Catherine's departure, but William could see the strain around her eyes. The way her movements had become slightly more careful, as if she were protecting herself against further emotional upheaval. "Thank you, Margaret," William replied, gesturing for her to take the seat across from his desk, the one Catherine had once occupied. "Please, sit for a moment. We should talk." Margaret looked surprised but settled herself into the chair with the dignity she brought to every interaction. Over the years, she had become far more than just Catherine's assistant. She had evolved into a trusted confidant and friend to both of them, someone who understood the unique pressures of their position in ways that few others could comprehend. "How are you managing?" William asked, his question carrying genuine concern. Margaret's loyalty to Catherine had been absolute, and her position now was complicated and delicate. "I'm adjusting, Your Royal Highness," she replied carefully. "Princess Catherine has been very thoughtful about the transition. She's made arrangements for all her ongoing projects to continue smoothly, and she's provided detailed notes about everything that might require attention in the coming months." William wasn't surprised. Even in the midst of personal upheaval, Catherine had maintained her characteristic attention to detail and concern for others. She wouldn't have left without ensuring that everyone who depended on her, from Margaret to the various charities she supported, would be cared for in her absence. "She's asked me to remain here, if you're comfortable with that arrangement," Margaret continued, "to help maintain continuity with the household and to assist with anything related to the children's needs." "Of course," William said immediately. "I can't imagine managing without your help. You've been such an integral part of this family." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "But I want you to know that you're free to speak honestly about how you're feeling. This situation has been difficult for everyone who cares about Catherine." Margaret's professional composure softened slightly. "She's remarkable, you know," she said quietly. Even when she was preparing to leave, her primary concern was for everyone else's well-being. She spent hours making lists, organizing information, ensuring that her departure would cause as little disruption as possible to the people around her. The image of Catherine working alone late at night, methodically planning for a future that would no longer include the life she had built, was almost unbearable. William could picture her in her study, surrounded by files and notebooks, approaching the dissolution of her marriage with the same careful attention she brought to organizing charity galas and state dinners. "Has she settled in well?" William asked, though he immediately wondered if the question was appropriate. The boundaries of their new relationship were still undefined, the protocols of separated royal spouses uncharted territory in the modern era. "She seems to be finding her footing," Margaret replied diplomatically. "The cottage is beautiful, very peaceful. She's been spending a lot of time in the garden and reading books she never had time for before." She hesitated, then added with careful delicacy, "She asks about you and the children in every conversation we have." The cottage was a property that had belonged to Catherine's family for generations, a converted farmhouse in the Cotswolds that had always served as her refuge from the pressures of royal life. She had retreated there during particularly stressful periods, finding solace in its simple charm and the anonymity it offered. It made sense that she would choose it as her sanctuary now, a place where she could rediscover who she was outside of her royal identity. A commotion from the hallway drew their attention, the sound of running footsteps and excited voices that could only belong to the children returning from their afternoon activities. William felt his heart lift slightly at the familiar chaos they brought with them wherever they went. Their resilience and boundless energy had been one of the few bright spots in the difficult weeks since Catherine's departure. George burst through the study door with his usual exuberance, his school uniform slightly disheveled, and his hair tousled from playing outside. At 11, he was beginning to show glimpses of the man he would become, but his enthusiasm remained thoroughly childlike. "Father, we had the most extraordinary day at school," he announced, barely pausing to acknowledge Margaret's presence before launching into an animated account of a science experiment involving vinegar and baking soda that had apparently resulted in a minor explosion in the chemistry lab. Charlotte appeared in the doorway more sedately, her uniform still pristine and her manner reflecting the careful grace she had inherited from her mother. At 9, she possessed an intuitive understanding of social dynamics that sometimes surprised the adults around her. "Hello, Daddy," she said, offering him a proper curtsy before moving to greet Margaret with a small hug. "Are you having tea? We had the most delicious biscuits at school today, but they weren't nearly as good as the ones Cook makes here." Lewis brought up the rear, still small enough at 6 that his energy seemed to vibrate through his entire body. He launched himself at William's legs with the fearless affection of the youngest child, secure in his position as the family's beloved baby, despite his protests that he was getting quite grown up. "Did Mummy call yet?" he asked, his question cutting straight through his siblings' chatter to the heart of what mattered most to him. "Not yet, but she will soon," William assured him, lifting Lewis onto his lap despite the boy's protests that he was too old for such babying. "She calls every day at the same time, remember?" "I know," Lewis replied with the exaggerated patience of a child explaining something obvious to a slow adult. "But I have very important news about the beetles we found in the garden, and I want to tell her before I forget any of the details." The mundane sweetness of the moment. Children eager to share their discoveries, the comfort of routine, the simple pleasure of family gathered together, provided a bittersweet contrast to the emotional complexity that shadowed their daily lives. These were the moments Catherine was missing, the small but significant experiences that formed the foundation of family life. Margaret excused herself discreetly, understanding that the children's arrival marked the transition from official business to family time. As she gathered the tea service and prepared to leave, she caught William's eye and offered a small smile that conveyed both support and understanding. Her presence had become a bridge between the life they had lived as a complete family and whatever version of family they were becoming now. "Can we call Mummy now?" Charlotte asked, settling herself into the chair Margaret had just vacated. "I want to tell her about the art project we started today. We're making portraits of our families, and I want to make sure I get her eyes exactly right." The innocent request hit William with unexpected force. Charlotte's desire to capture her mother's likeness perfectly, to preserve Catherine's image in watercolor and memory, was both touching and heartbreaking. It spoke to a child's instinctive need to hold on to connection even when circumstances forced physical separation. "We'll call her at the usual time," William promised, checking his watch. "That's only 20 minutes away. Why don't you use that time to gather everything you want to tell her?" The children scattered to collect their school projects and important discoveries, leaving William alone in the sudden quiet of the study. In 20 minutes, he would facilitate another video call between his children and their mother, maintaining the facade of normalcy that protected them from the full complexity of adult decisions and consequences. He had become skilled at managing these conversations, at creating space for the children's natural expressions of love, while carefully navigating the emotional minefield of his own feelings. Each call was a reminder of what they had been as a family and what they might still become in some different form. Catherine's face on the screen, animated and loving as she listened to the children's stories, was both a comfort and a source of pain. She looked well, rested in a way he hadn't seen for months before her departure. But there was also a distance in her eyes, as if she was already beginning the process of building a new life that didn't center around the rhythms of royal responsibility. The study fell silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece, marking time with the same steady rhythm that had witnessed centuries of royal dramas and personal upheavals. In 20 minutes, he would see Catherine's face again, would hear her voice asking about his day with the careful politeness of two people learning to be friends after being everything to each other. It was progress of a sort, but it felt nothing like the easy intimacy they had once shared. 6 months had passed since that morning when Catherine walked out of the castle and into an uncertain future. The seasons had changed, autumn giving way to winter, and then gradually yielding to the tentative promises of spring. Life had developed new rhythms, different but not necessarily diminished, as both William and Catherine learned to navigate their separate worlds while maintaining the delicate bonds that connected them through their children and their shared history. The cottage in the Cotswolds had become more than just Catherine's temporary refuge. It was transforming into something that felt like home in a way the castle never quite had. She had spent months stripping away layers of obligation and expectation, rediscovering interests and passions that had been dormant for years beneath the weight of royal duty. Her hands were often dirty now from working in the garden, her schedule determined by her own needs rather than the demands of public appearances, and charitable obligations. She had started painting again, something she hadn't done since university. The small studio she had set up in what was once the cottage's second bedroom was filled with canvases depicting the changing seasons outside her windows, the play of light across the rolling hills, the delicate progression of wildflowers through their yearly cycle. The act of creating something purely for the joy of creation, without consideration for public reception or royal appropriateness, had been profoundly healing. Her days began with long walks through the countryside, often before dawn when the world was quiet, and the air held the crisp clarity that only came in the early morning hours. These solitary journeys had become a form of meditation, a time when she could think clearly about who she was becoming without the constant background noise of other people's expectations. She was discovering aspects of herself that had been dormant for so long, she had almost forgotten they existed. The children visited regularly, sometimes individually and sometimes together, their presence filling the cottage with laughter and the comfortable chaos that only young people could create. They had adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience, treating their mother's cottage as simply another home rather than a symbol of family dissolution. For them, it was an adventure, a place where they could pick berries from the hedgerows, collect eggs from the small flock of chickens Catherine had acquired, and fall asleep to the sound of owls calling across the fields. "I like it here, Mummy," Charlotte had said during her last visit, helping Catherine prepare dinner in the cottage's small kitchen. "It feels cozy, like we're playing house, but for real." The observation had pleased Catherine more than she could express. Charlotte's ability to find joy and comfort in their new arrangement was a testament to the child's adaptability and, also, Catherine hoped, to her own success in creating a space that felt nurturing and secure rather than sad or diminished. William visited as well, though less frequently, and with a careful formality that spoke to the delicate nature of their evolving relationship. Their conversations were cordial, focused primarily on the children's needs and schedules, but occasionally they would slip into the easy familiarity that had characterized their relationship for so many years. These moments of connection were both precious and painful, reminders of what they had shared and what they had chosen to leave behind. During his most recent visit, they had walked through Catherine's garden together while the children played on the swing he had helped install beneath the ancient oak tree in the back garden. The physical work of hanging the swing, measuring, drilling, testing the ropes for safety, had felt remarkably normal, like something any divorced couple might do for their children's happiness. "You look well," William had said as they paused beside the vegetable patch Catherine had been cultivating with obvious pride. "Rested? Happy?" "I am," Catherine had replied, surprised by the truth of her own words. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm living my own life rather than performing someone else's version of what my life should be." The honesty of her statement had hung in the air between them, not accusatory, but simply factual. William had nodded, understanding flowing between them without the need for lengthy explanations. He could see the changes in her, the way she moved more freely, spoke more spontaneously, seemed to inhabit her own skin with greater comfort than she had in years. "The children are thriving," he had observed, watching as George taught Louis how to pump his legs to make the swing go higher. "They seem to understand that this arrangement doesn't mean we love them any less." "Children are remarkably adaptable when they feel secure," Catherine had agreed. "As long as they know they're loved by both of us, they can adjust to almost any living situation." They had stood there in comfortable silence, watching their children play in the golden afternoon light, and for a moment it had felt almost like the old days, two parents sharing quiet pride in their offspring, connected by bonds that transcended the complicated nature of their personal relationship. The difference was that now these moments felt precious precisely because they were no longer taken for granted. As spring deepened into early summer, Catherine found herself thinking less about what she had lost and more about what she was building. She had begun volunteering at the local primary school, helping children with reading difficulties, work that was meaningful but completely removed from the grand charitable initiatives that had defined her royal role. The simplicity of sitting with a 7-year-old struggling with phonics, offering patient encouragement, and celebrating small victories, felt more authentically rewarding than many of the high-profile events she had once attended. She was also writing, something she had never had time for during her years as a working royal. What had started as journal entries to help process her feelings about the separation had evolved into something more substantial, a memoir of sorts that explored the tension between public duty and private authenticity. She wasn't sure if she would ever share it with anyone else, but The act of putting her thoughts into words was helping her make sense of the journey she had taken. The local community had embraced her with a warmth that surprised her. Her neighbors knew who she was, of course, but they treated her primarily as Catherine rather than as the Princess of Wales. She was invited to village fetes and book clubs, asked to contribute to charity drives, and help with school fundraisers, included in the everyday life of the community in ways that felt both normal and revolutionary. It's like you've discovered a different way of being useful, her mother had observed during a recent visit. You're still making a difference in people's lives, but it's more direct, more personal. The observation had resonated deeply with Catherine. She was beginning to understand that service didn't require grand gestures or formal ceremonies. Sometimes the most meaningful contributions came from simply showing up, being present, offering whatever skills and resources you possessed to address immediate, tangible needs. Meanwhile, William was learning his own lessons about adaptation and growth. The initial shock of Catherine's departure had given way to a deeper understanding of the changes that needed to happen in his own life. He was spending more individual time with each of the children, developing relationships with them that were less filtered through Catherine's organizing presence. He was discovering aspects of fatherhood that he had previously left largely to her management. He was also examining his own relationship with the role he would one day inherit. Catherine's departure had forced him to confront questions about duty and personal fulfillment that he had been avoiding for years. Her courage in choosing her own path, despite the enormous pressure to maintain appearances, had inspired him to think more critically about how he wanted to approach his future responsibilities. She's shown me that it's possible to serve people authentically, he had confided to his father during one of their regular private conversations. That maybe the most radical thing we can do is to be genuinely ourselves, even within the constraints of our positions. Charles had listened with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades wrestling with similar questions. The monarchy has survived by adapting, he had replied. Each generation has to find its own way of being relevant and meaningful. Perhaps Catherine's choice will help you find yours. On a warm evening in late June, nearly a year after their separation began, William found himself walking through the cottage garden where Catherine was deadheading roses as the sun set behind the hills. The children were inside, absorbed in a board game that had generated considerable laughter and mock outrage. This visit had felt different from the others, more relaxed, less burdened by unspoken grief and regret. I have something to tell you, Catherine said, setting down her gardening shears and turning to face him fully. Her expression was serious, but not sad, containing a gravity that suggested important news rather than crisis. William felt his chest tighten slightly, though he wasn't sure what he feared hearing. Over the months of their separation, he had dreaded the possibility that she might announce plans to make their arrangement permanent, to move forward with divorce proceedings that would legally sever the bonds that still connected them. I've been offered a position, she continued. Director of Rural Education Initiatives for a nonprofit that works with underserved communities. It would be based here in the Cotswolds, but it would involve travel throughout England and Wales. Real work, meaningful work, using everything I learned during my royal years, but in a completely different context. Relief flooded through William so powerfully that he had to sit down on the stone bench beside the herb garden. She wasn't leaving, not in any permanent sense. She was building something new, creating a life that honored both her need for authenticity and her desire to serve others. That sounds perfect for you, he said, and meant it completely. You've always been most alive when you're working directly with people, especially children. It would mean I could stay here, in this area, Catherine said, settling beside him on the bench. The children could continue their current arrangement, spending time at the castle and time here. We could keep being a family, just a different kind of family than we originally planned. The evening air was soft around them, filled with the scent of honeysuckle and the distant sound of sheep calling across the fields. Inside the cottage, the children's voices continued their cheerful argument about board game rules, the sound of young people completely secure in their world despite its unconventional nature. I think, William said carefully, that might be exactly what we all need. He looked at her in the fading light, seeing the woman he had fallen in love with years ago, but also recognizing the new strength and clarity she had developed. You found yourself again, and maybe that gives all of us permission to find new versions of ourselves too. Catherine smiled, the first completely unguarded expression of happiness he had seen from her since before their troubles began. I think we might actually be okay, she said. Different than we planned, But okay. Maybe even better than okay. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, William found himself thinking about goodbye. Not the painful farewell they had shared that morning months ago, but the gentle goodbye to who they had been before, the release of expectations that had constrained them all. Sometimes the most important goodbyes weren't endings at all, but beginnings dressed in different clothes, opportunities to discover new ways of loving and living and being family together. The cottage glowed warmly behind them, filled with the voices of their children and the promise of whatever tomorrow might bring. They sat together in comfortable silence, no longer husband and wife in the traditional sense, but still connected by bonds that ran deeper than any legal document or royal protocol could define. They had found their way to a different kind of forever, one that honored both love and growth, duty and authenticity, together and apart.